Announcements are normally used at the beginning of meetings, which is why I've kind of placed this one as the first slide. And, they're essential in moving forward on a path to reconciliation. And they're also influenced by the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action in acknowledging the first occupants of this land. So welcome everybody. Today's presentation, as Gord mentions, is about setting the stage to understand affordability, to present, and a very important information graphic that was created by the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation called the Housing Continuum. And so if everybody could make sure that they're muted today, I am hearing a little bit of feedback. And so hi, everybody. Thanks so much. I am no longer hearing the feedback. And so today, I just want to also share, we're not getting into any solutions. This is not a call to action. Rather, it's an information session on a pretty complex issue. And so when it comes to solutions, however, what we know so far in Canada and in Hamilton especially is that there is no one solution. We obviously wish that there was, but there is no smoking gun and there's no magic bullet when it comes to creating affordable housing solutions. So we do hope to update this presentation because we have used a lot of census data, StatsCan data as it relates to the Hamilton CMA. And so we're hoping and excited to see what trends will emerge as all of you, sure, as fellow planners and real estate folks are excited to see what trends are emerging or changing. And so, hi everybody, I'm Jasmine Tranter, and I've worked in affordable housing and planning in Ottawa and Vancouver. And it was always kind of my goal, my dream to work in different places in Canada. So I'm very lucky to have been hired by Chris Phillips and Ray Kessler. Thank you. And so I'm really happy today to connect with the wider PED community because part of my role will entail submitting planning applications myself or alongside applicants in the need to create affordable housing solutions. So that's the end of my introduction, James.
So I'm James O'Brien. I'm an SPM with Housing Services. My main area is the Housing and Homeless Action Plan and kind of our strategic planning within the area. And I work with all four of our teams on various projects. But my home team is the Investment in Affordable Housing team, which deals a lot with our development. So we have some interaction with the planning folks, of course.
Okay, so here's our agenda for today. James and I will be co-presenting the following information in our 101 presentation. And I want to caveat again, the data is CMA and it's citywide. I acknowledge Hamilton is a community of communities and there are many differences there within. But we've taken a broad overview and given a snapshot for the entire geographic area. So I believe James is going to start in the part one by introducing some of the history.
Yeah, so as Jasmine said, a lot of today is talking not so much about the solutions, but just kind of an understanding of where we are and how we got here. So just from a quick history lesson that talks about where we are for affordable housing and the impacts is just a federal housing or federal investment housing has been trending downwards for a number of decades, which impacts our ability to create more affordable housing. From a rental housing perspective, most of it was built decades ago. So we've had quite a gap now in housing in general, rental housing, not just affordable rental housing, but from a supply perspective. And then how this all kind of meshes together from a socioeconomic status. We've had unemployment rates that are higher than they would have been even before our big rental housing boom previously. So the point of this is just to make sure that we have a bit of a shared understanding of where the challenges were in the past and how we've been addressing them, and then what can happen going forward. So I think, yep. So the next slide, we're just going to go over a couple of definitions, just because housing services, like many areas, there's a lot of jargon. So I just wanted to find a couple of things really quick. There will be, when this gets sent out to your department, there will be a list of definitions here, but I just want to overview it so nobody necessarily gets lost in the kind of the conversation. Affordable community and social housing. Sometimes the terms are kind of used interchangeably, but they are slightly different, mainly affordable and social housing. Affordable housing talks about some of our nonprofit providers who are providing housing solutions. To know a name, Indowell would come to mind for something like that. And then we have social housing, where these are the providers who are providing rent geared to income housing. So City Housing Hamilton would be an example of that. And then community housing is actually a new term that's been created that is more of an umbrella term that captures both affordable and social housing in the mix there. Average market rent talks about the rent paid by the rental community who is currently in a unit. So the average of what those is, that can be broken down by the unit type. So bachelor, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, etc. But we can also break it down geographically. So average market rent for a certain area of the city based on the bedrooms type. Housing affordability is different than affordable housing. Everybody has a housing affordability. It's what you can afford to pay for your housing. Basically, that's the 30% of income that you may have heard when we talk about housing affordability. But when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about the I guess the segment of our community that needs some support. Normally, obviously, on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Whereas housing affordability, if you're making $1 million a year, you still have a housing affordability threshold. The housing continuum, which we'll get into a little bit later to outline, just talks about how the different types of housing all fall along a linear continuum that kind of encapsulates all the different types of housing. Low to moderate incomes. Generally, when we look at this, we talk about the bottom 60% of the income spectrum, and that would be traditionally, in some definitions, be where affordable housing is geared towards. Rent geared to income, I think I mentioned that earlier about social housing. So that's guaranteed rents based on your income level that's provided by social housing providers. So this is where those who may be in receipt of OW or ODSP, or maybe low income wage earners, where their income threshold, or sorry, their rent threshold is set based on their income. So there's no market analysis as part of that. And then tenure is just the type of housing. So if it's rental versus ownership, so mortgage versus rental.
Mhm. And I just want to reiterate, you don't, if anyone's trying to take notes, there is a list of definition in this presentation at the end, and it will be circulated by email. So thanks, James. That was, it's excellent. It is jargon heavy. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
So here's the housing continuum I referred to. So if you take a look on there, you'll see how it's broken down by CMHC into your homeless, emergency shelters, all the way up to market home ownership. I think it would probably be uh, notable or obvious to most that obviously not all housing fits in these exactly perfect segments, but it just gives you an idea of how people may start and transition through the continuum. Most people at some point will occupy different parts of this continuum. The only question is, I guess, how much they stretch out from the entire item on it. So we look at the bottom end there, the emergency housing solutions, affordable non-market housing, and then market housing. And that's kind of where all housing falls in.
Yes. And now if we turn our attention to ourselves within the official plan, here is our definition. We define affordable housing by housing tenure type. And so, in the next few slides, this presentation will give a snapshot of income ranges, low and moderate income ranges, but also will share our income distribution in Hamilton. Both so we're going to look at what low and moderate income means from a program perspective through housing services and CMHC, but also, as I mentioned, we're going to get into displaying what gross annual household data is from StatsCan, so that we know kind of what types of housing the city is targeting today in our planning documents. So James is going to speak to examples of what our senior government partners tell us should be market rental rates. And for information, benchmark housing prices will not be displayed at today's presentation. But just in terms of future lunch and learns, maybe there's an opportunity for us to carry forward this conversation and display more information around benchmark housing prices.
Yeah, so this is an infographic that we've contained that's part of our housing and homeless action plan to help provide an understanding of affordability. So when we talk about the AMRs, the 40%, the 60%, the 80%, where they fall in the income level and what it means for people being able to move along the continuum. So as you'll see, it's noted that folks on the who are paying even as high as 125% of average market rent, it probably means that they're in a situation that's cost prohibitive to enter the housing, the home ownership market. So it's just trying to put some numbers to that. And just as an idea for folks, when we look at that 80% AMR for a bachelor unit in Hamilton, right now it's $718. One bedroom would be 877-ish dollars. And this is why it's important just from a jargon perspective. When we talk about average market rent, it refers to people who are currently in a rental situation, because I don't know how many people have maybe been apartment hunting lately, but you would be hard pressed to find a bachelor or one bedroom for those prices in most of Hamilton right now. And this is why the affordability also, when we talk about affordable rent, if you look on the chart there, all the way up to 125% of average market rent. Because again, trying to find actual units available for folks who are looking for housing can be challenging. So this is just meant to give an understanding of where incomes fall within the spectrum there. And I think if we go to the next slide, we dive a little bit
Yeah.
more into those, really highlight the income levels.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the low income, the very low income, et cetera, looking at folks who may be on OW or ODSP, part-time wage, full-time wage, and even all the way up to moderate incomes when we talk about the starting salary of certain professionals type of idea, and how that might impact finding housing. And I would add that, when we get to the low and the moderately low income and the moderate income, is that starting to stretch where affordable or non-market housing would be able to serve, and where market housing may have traditionally been looked at, and how those kind of interact. And I think that's a big portion of, I guess, what we're talking about today is how along the continuum there's the affordable housing aspect, the part that the Housing Services Division kind of focuses on and supports, and then obviously how market housing and that blend together, and how there's opportunities for the city as a whole to be trying to address those challenges. So then just taking it back to the continuum here one more time, just to, again, kind of look at how social housing fits into that picture of affordable rental and affordable ownership, because we have had programs in the past to help encourage affordable home ownership. And then when we get into the rental market, the market side of it and the market ownership. So again, it's just trying to understand how all of our different housing fits along this continuum, and how it's important, I think, to have a healthy continuum, because a healthy continuum all the way along supports all of the aspects of it, so that people can hopefully move to within the continuum where it's best suitable for them. So then just a summary, so that jargon issue, so some of those definitions that come up, particularly around the definition of affordability when we talk about that 30% of your income, or it could also be, like I said, the bottom 2/3 or that bottom 60% of the income spectrum. Different programs have different definitions of how those overlap. And we have those definitions from the upper levels of government, and some that we've defined ourselves to a degree. But then how housing, affordable housing, social housing, and market housing all fit along a continuum for understanding.
Okay, so now we're on to part two of describing key parts of the city's affordable housing program in the context of the CMHC housing continuum. So this section will share a snapshot of growth and demand and also housing affordability indicators. In this section, we'll also take you through an example of how to calculate a household's affordability levels in relation to their housing costs. So we'll run through a snapshot of the indicators listed here. And so noting for everybody, this is not a complete list, but my hope was really to share a slightly broader perspective and include information on our provincial and local economy in relation to real estate. And I hope to demonstrate for you how the government, is competing for affordable housing in the marketplace in order to fulfill, our mandates of creating affordable housing solutions for low and moderate residents. As many of you know, have studied this information, our population is increasing. According to our labor market reports, employment decreased in Ontario. Unemployment was at 9.3% in May of 2021. And by comparison, in February 2020, our unemployment rate was at a 5.5% level. And so this graph shows employment trends in Ontario from 2005 to 2021. And again, I highlighted this information to kind of help share the magnitude of the pandemic on employment rates. And what's not displayed here is that, individuals aged 15 to 24, visible minorities and women, the Ontario unemployment rate is lower. Ontario lost jobs, this year. And so alongside unemployment, the Ontario Consumer Price Index is an indicator of change in consumer prices. And so the red line here displays CPI, all shelter items. And so, CPI shelter refers to shelter cost changes independent of any changes in the dwelling unit. So in the case of a rental unit, for example, the shelter CPI accounts for changes in amenities and services offered to tenants, renovations or new units being built. And for owned homes, shelter CPI accounts for mortgage rates, replacement costs, for property taxes, homeowner and mortgage insurance, maintenance and repairs, and other owned expenses. And so what the government of Ontario is telling us is CPI shelter is increasing at a greater rate than all items. Alongside the cost of goods and services, each year the Altus Group publishes low and high construction cost estimates. And so I've taken a snapshot for the GTA. The City of Hamilton is not kind of part of the information that the Altus Group publishes for free, like many other mid-sized Canadian cities. And so this information provides a range of construction costs, and the construction costs can vary due to several various factors. But generally speaking, over the past 3 years, GTA construction costs are increasing. So the highest cost built form here is condo apartments up to 12 stories. And yeah, so it's a general benchmark and it's a shallow trend, but it's showing us an increase. Alongside our construction costs, one other metric that is used frequently in terms of understanding what's happening in real estate markets is the capitalization rates. It's a measure that it's used to measure the potential return on multifamily residential real estate investments. Once again, this information is published for free through Colliers International. And once again, it's for the GTA. Hamilton is not part of the free information they provide. But I wanted to present this information again, just in terms of the broader context. Generally as a cap rate fall, the price of real estate values will rise. So over the past 3 years, again, small trend, but over the past 3 years, we've seen cap rates fall, especially in the last quarter of 2020 and early 2021. And so here's some information from MLS as another indicator of what's happening in the market today in Hamilton. So this one is Hamilton specific. Um, through MLS, they published information on their website around listing and sales. But if we think about, what's happening locally, this is a further indicator, of price increases due to market activity. Overall, since 2015, all housing types, the sales for all housing types rather has increased since that year. And while there are more annual property listings and sales annually, we think that as the gap between the two closes, the prices increase. And this is due to higher demand outpacing the supply. And so just for information, in terms of the information, the listings and sales are cumulative and are for a mix of apartments, attached, and residential dwelling properties. Finally, borrowing remains low. The cost to borrow remains low. Conventional 5-year mortgage in blue, it's decreased over the past year, but and alongside our interest rates through the Bank of Canada. Borrowing money is less expensive, so this can facilitate housing demand and development. In summary, the market, there is some uncertainty, as we all know, labor and price in terms of the information that I brought forward today. And then also, to no one's surprise, in Hamilton, the housing market is growing, and our costs to borrow are low. And so James is going to carry on in the presentation, and yeah.
Yes. So we're going to go through just some affordability indicators. So some of the details about housing in Hamilton. So our first slide here, we're just going to talk about the households in Hamilton. I think we go to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. So just by tenure. So just to kind of see, so obviously we're going to have that updated census data that was being discussed. So very soon we will have a nice 2021 graph to go with this, but seeing how we've had a little bit of growth in the total housing. And one of the things I would just highlight is that growth in rental households. So you see the 4.4% and the 6.3% over the 10 years. It does not mean that there's been an increase in apartment style builds by any means. What that means is, if you actually dive into the census data, is there's been a growth in townhouses. Most notably, that's the largest growth area of rental units in Hamilton. So just trying to, again, kind of draw that picture. You'll see obviously more ownership than rental, but as a whole, we have a lot of rental in Hamilton. And if we break that down by geographic area, the old city of Hamilton would be where our majority of rental units are. So keep moving along here. Just seeing a little bit over time of how the rental and the ownership market has changed a little bit. We've seen a little bit of a drop in the number of subsidized units we've had from 2011 to 2016. And then again, when you look at from an ownership perspective, the growth in those with mortgage versus those without a mortgage. So just trying to put some context around the housing market as a whole. When we look at the family types, it should be noted the majority of rental households are one person households. You'll see that's significantly larger. Not exactly, but it almost equals the number of family households or lone parent households who are in the rental market overall. But when we look at the majority of ownership, it is the families either with no children or families with children who dominate the ownership market. So again, it's just trying to get, I think, an understanding, and this is where we're talking about today, about first principles, if you will, about understanding all of the market aspects of affordable housing. So it comes to affordability, but also who do we serve? Who are the folks most likely to, I think, be accessing the housing we're talking about? So from a housing stock, if you recall from that extremely brief history lesson at the start when we talked about the builds having kind of ended at 1990. From a general overall housing supply, we have a lot of old housing in Hamilton. So this is a picture from the 2016 census data about how old it is, 40 years or older, the 40 to 20 years, and the 20 years or older. And you just see from a renter perspective, there's not much built in the last 20 years. And I think if we broke that number down further, what you would see is some of the townhouses that are being rented would make up that very small sliver of orange in the 20 years or newer. So when we talk about that healthy continuum, just to try and bring it back to that, is this is where having adequate rental supply is important from both an affordable side, but even the market side of the continuum to make sure that people are able to move throughout it. And then from an income perspective, so one, I guess for this one here, what I would highlight if you look at '05, 2010, and then 2015, is really the growth of the blue at the top. So when we talk about the percentiles, that bottom 60%, uh, that was in the 60 to $80,000, and then has moved a little bit in 2010. And if you look in 2015, you'll see how that 60 percentile is now in the 80 to 100,000. And this is where some of our definition challenges are. Is uh, it's not that it's a bad thing that we have higher incomes being posted in, or sorry, being had in Hamilton. It's just trying to understand where the challenges are within the housing continuum for providing affordable housing and who that would be for, but then also where's the market solutions for what we would call that missing middle of folks who might not be in the ownership market, but would also be looking to rent as one, or even the missing middle in the ownership side on the low end. So it's just a notable understanding. And I think if we go to the next slide, we have a little bit of an add to this slide that just highlights that.
Yeah, and I want to add, James, that this table is here to describe the proportion of Hamilton's household within each kind of income bracket as they're listed in uh, this table. This table is made up of all the universe of the private household. So I think, in 2015, our household count was just over 210, 100,000, 100,000 people, sorry. And just for information, for context, yes, it is before tax household income.
And
Yep.
sorry, Jasmine, I'm just going to go off the board here
No, go ahead.
slightly to what we talked about pre-presentation. I was just going to add that I realize when we talk about percentiles, those who might not be shoulder deep in census data might not always know what that is. So the way it makes it that 100% is the percentiles mean there's an equal number of households in each 10% increment. So that's why if you're looking at the colors and saying how come the percentile is different, so it's just notable. So when we say 21% are making less or making more than 100,000 there, the percentages in each of the gaps of percentile are the exact same number of households. Hopefully that was clear. I apologize for going off the board on
please,
that.
please ask us some questions, essentially. Yeah, but James, you were going to carry on and situate the average household incomes
Yeah,
within the
so
context of our distribution in Hamilton.
yeah, so just looking at kind of how those numbers have shifted higher, which obviously makes a little bit of sense, but it talks about um, where the incomes then fall in the percentile distribution for who is that bottom 60%, and how the market is going to meet uh, that missing middle. I think it is a big highlight there. And so this is where when we talk about that 60%, the affordable versus non-affordable. So when, again, this is where, the nice, neat definitions in reality, I think is where we see that overlap that we're talking about. Because if you look at the high end of the affordable non-market housing, again, we see how that starts to slip into higher and higher incomes, that 80 to 100,000 threshold there. And that's where from housing services and from the core group that we're really looking to serve, I think from the non-market housing, the subsidized housing, if you will, it's definitely the lower end of that spectrum who we're trying to serve and who is we're trying to find units for. So it's if you have the enough supply throughout the continuum, it helps. Again, it comes back to that healthy continuum idea. I think we have, yeah. So core housing need. So this is a concept of folks who may have that affordability challenge, that 30% spending more than 30% of their income on their rent and utilities, but suitability and adequacy. So is the unit in good repair? Is it suitable for family size? Those all feed into core housing need. And just a quick little graphic there that breaks down how core housing need fits across Hamilton. The graphic here, I believe, just describes our rental households across Hamilton. In the 2016 census data, I believe it was 10.8% of Hamilton households overall were in core housing need. We have a two-pager on that on the Housing Services website that has the right number for sure, but I think it was about 10.8. And you'll see Hamilton Center there. So I was kind of saying the old city of Hamilton, Hamilton Center there, where we have the most of our rental stock is in the greatest core housing need across Hamilton. So when we talk about that housing affordability number, that number that everybody has, this is where, just as a quick example, if a family household was making about $70,000 a year, you would divide that out by 12 months, get your monthly income, multiply that by 30%. And so for this example, we would be talking about $1,700, just over that, for monthly housing costs. And just as an example for that, 100% of AMR for a 3-bedroom apartment would be $1,500. That's a 100. So that again is people already in their units. If you were to look on Kijiji tomorrow, I think you would again be hard pressed to find units at 100% of AMR. So again, it speaks to that challenge of the rental supply, particularly from a affordable housing and housing continuum standpoint.
Yeah, so this is an important calculation that we do often when we're thinking about feasibility and viability for projects, but also relating it back to serving needs in the community, household needs in the community. So it's the yeah, great calculation to have available to us. And it's also something that the federal government and federal departments, will have on their websites, like Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, for example, has this calculator available to all Canadians to demonstrate, within the family budget, what's affordable in a household. And it's really that government kind of policy telling us um, how to afford a home in Canada today.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the summary of where the indicators are pointing us. And I think so. The reason that's important is it talks about the lack of new builds being done in the rental supply area. That's a challenge in both the affordable rental supply being built as well as the lack of market rental supply. It speaks to how the demographics impact where we need to focus our work. Family units are a big item, but also the single individuals who tend to be more represented in the rental market. And I think for me from housing services, I guess for joining you folks today, and I appreciate the invite, is talking about how from a whole city perspective, how the continuum feeds into everybody's work, and how in a housing services context where I guess we're more of the social services side and we're focused on that more affordable side and more of a supportive housing side, where there's also work that impacts us and helps us when there's a healthy continuum overall. And I think some of those market solutions that obviously probably feed into some of the work that planning and economic development does.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
So I'm Jennifer. I'm part of the Employee Engagement Committee hosting today, and I will be taking any questions that have been written in the chat, which there are none. Don't worry, guys. I've got a bunch for you. Feel free to also raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask questions if you'd prefer to do it in that format. Fun little note. Does 30% include, like, if you're a homeowner, property tax and bills, as well as just like your mortgage?
Yeah, the government of Canada, CMHC, and the Financial Consumer Agency will tell you, yes, housing costs are a bucket in the family budget, so to speak,
Okay.
and that's usually something that would be included in a housing cost. And then if you think about renters, for example, renters, will be passed along that cost through their landlord, based on how that works.
I think I need to find somewhere new to live. I'm stretching it too much.
Yeah.
As probably
It is a personal topic though, right?
Yeah.
Because it does hit home. So, you
Yeah.
know, we do appreciate that this can be a personal topic, especially when it comes to housing and incomes. But it's one that's important also to the sector and also the mission and the mandate of the three levels of government today.
Right. Okay, so we've got a first question in the chat from Charlie. He's asking, does the city of Hamilton offer any incentives for new market purpose built rental housing?
So maybe I can jump in on that first when we kind of talk about purpose built from an affordable supply standpoint. There is an incentive in the sense that we are supported by some funding from both the federal and provincial government for new affordable housing developments we do. We go through a request for proposal with that and get applications and partnerships. And that's where, again, I think I mentioned Indowell, our Good Shepherd, YWCA, City Housing Hamilton. That's where those type of purpose-built rental projects have been built from. They are specifically affordable housing. From a broader perspective of the market side, um, I don't know if there is through some of the CIP programs. Would it be market specific or is it just incentives for?
CIP, Community Improvement Plan
Yeah.
area for everyone who might not know.
Sorry, yeah. In those, I'm not sure if it speaks to rental specifically or if it is just for renewal. I don't know if Jasmine knows that or one of the colleagues on the call.
Yeah, so again, we really just wanted to present data and some evidence around what's happening in our communities with respect to our households. We know that we had 40 minutes or so to present our data, and we would love to come back and talk more about the incentives, but also the barriers when it comes to creating affordable housing solutions, whether it's an emergency housing solution or a non-market rental housing solution. So we would really love to come back and do that environmental scan. I work in economic development, and I've been here for a minute at the city of Hamilton. I don't know all of the incentive programs by heart, but if there is a market rental housing incentive program, I need to know.
Yeah.
So that's my editorial, James. That's my answer. And
Okay.
Jennifer, that's my
Yeah,
answer. Yeah.
no, that's good. We've got a few questions about
Is it just me that Jennifer cut out for, or?
No,
No,
I lost her too.
we lost
So,
Jennifer.
Okay, so I wonder if we can just jump through some of the questions in the chat, maybe then,
yeah,
and if
go for
Jennifer.
it,
So,
James.
so why don't we answer
For
so this one here
yeah.
says, how did they determine the 30% used in calculating how much is affordable? Does any
Yeah.
input on that?
Yeah, so
Mm,
the data we receive from like CMHC, they have a data side to them, and they're doing like surveys through the system as well as they can pull data from other data sources about the rental being paid. So it's like census data. They do research work on that. That's how they come up with the 30% um, of who's paying that. Am I understanding the question correctly, or have I missed it there?
No, I think that, yeah, that's what they
Okay.
were asking, is sort of how they developed that 30%. If there's any sort of reasoning behind it, or if it's just a number. That seems to be the same number that they've used for many years. So I don't know whether it's time to update that number or not, but.
Yeah, so on that, I think it's based on, yeah, if 30% being roughly a third of the income going to the housing costs would be reasonable. So it's been an agreed upon number, I think, for some time. I don't know the history of
mhm.
exactly where it came from.
Yeah, I would just repeat what I mentioned earlier in terms of family budgets, and supporting families or yourself as an individual or household, whatever your composition, in terms of making sure you're planning for retirement, etc. So you know, and paying your various other costs, car, transportation. The government of Canada's come up with this formula.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Really just the rule of thumb, really, in my opinion. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. Well, let's move on. So Judy, did you guys get a chance to read Judy's
Yeah.
question? So
Yeah.
I know this is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of the presentation, but maybe if there's any comments that you could make.
Yeah, I would argue. I mean, from a just an overall social services aspect, I do think that's being done overall when you're talking about our goal to end homelessness. This is a work of where we have the caseworkers who work in the shelter setting, as an example, trying to work with individuals to resolve homelessness. We have our Housing First program that tries to help people get into stable housing. I think, kind of on the question, the other factors, if you're talking about, well, that's a pretty far-reaching idea, because one of the things when you look at the homeless population is the individuality of each case. I think we could get into conversations here about, Jasmine, in part of the stats she was sharing about the unemployment rate and, you know jobs, and just not just affordable rents. When you talk about that, I think this is where in the city right now, where we have conversations about mental health and substance abuse, and all those aspects, and the support out there. I think those are all of the things that feed into that. So I would argue that from a city perspective, we do have a number of things that are being done to try and address those, not just the housing portion of it, but there is a concept of the housing first idea of helping folks get stable housing with supports that they can start, and then all these other supports that get layered in to help resolve maybe the different challenges they're facing overall, to create long-term sustainable housing solutions.
That's
Yeah.
great.
I don't have anything to add there.
That's great. Then that's a good answer. I think that's pretty good answer. I think Jennifer had a question of her own, and I can't
Oh,
recall what.
yeah.
Are
No,
you
I'm
still there,
back.
Jennifer? Oh, you're back.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks to
Good.
my
Good.
Wi-Fi. So spotty today, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thanks for your patience. I was wondering, you gave us that history lesson, and then I was curious what we've capitalized on that in a local setting to create affordable social housing units.
Yeah, so there's been a number of uh, funding initiatives through the upper levels of government that we've accessed and had allocations to Hamilton that we've been able to build supply on. We look at things like the investment in affordable housing and the investment in affordable housing extension, which are joint programs with the feds and the province. When you throw in they called it SIF, Social Infrastructure Fund, and these are just, funding pots that they named that had allocations to the city that we were able to do those requests for proposals to help fund new builds. Right now, we've had a rapid housing initiative that's been done by the federal government during the pandemic to try and help create more affordable housing. So there's a number of, I would say, definite successes we can point to in the city of Hamilton over the last, I guess, even 5 to 10 years, where we've had new affordable supply with our partners. There's um, Good Shepherd and Indowell and YWCA, and lots of these providers who have been in the mix for building units. City Housing Hamilton's had a number of projects that I'm sure some folks have heard about. There's projects on the horizon that have been in the news at different points in time. The biggest challenge, I think, with some of these is the fact that there is a relying factor on funding pots beyond even the city of Hamilton. We had a $50 million project poverty reduction fund that was approved 2021, so probably 4 years ago now, that helped build new units as well as repair social housing units. But as much as 50 million is a large pot of money that city council was able to dedicate towards this. When you put it over 10 years for impact, and from a construction standpoint of building units, the impact is still not reaching our full need in Hamilton.
Mhm. Interesting. Thank you. Are there any questions that people want to? You can just unmute yourself and ask away. I don't see any new ones in the chat. I have another question. Nobody else? Okay, I'll go ahead. So you talked about some of the data points around the population that we're serving. Are we prioritizing certain groups? Like, are we building more single, like 1-bedroom units versus family units, or how do we control for that? Maybe that's solution oriented, but
Yeah, it is, and it's something that's it's maybe the most unsatisfying part of this presentation is that we didn't get into tools and what to do, because when I started in affordable housing, it was like I really want to get down to doing something and something tangible. And please let us know. Please let Gord and Jennifer know, to everybody here today, if you do want to have a part 2 of this presentation. We definitely want to get into tools. And we felt that, hopefully to everyone's satisfaction, to someone's satisfaction, it's like we wanted to get into the demographic and the population, and also the local economy as it relates to real estate, before going there. Because there are so many tools, and there are so many tools that we're using today, and I hope that it doesn't seem like we don't want to go there, or that we're not practicing that in Hamilton today. But that question specifically, James, it reminds me of kind of this idea of us working within 3 levels of government, and through our various levels of government. Primarily, the Government of Canada, CMHC, is telling us, at least with especially their latest funding program, what groups should and should be prioritized within the system. But James definitely is the one to answer that,
Sure.
specifically.
Yeah, well, I would just jump in and say, from an affordable housing standpoint, we do have a little bit of influence. I wouldn't necessarily call it control, but influence on it. We can talk about both through publishing information we have about, for example, the demographic data on the wait list, and talking about what we know about the households on the wait list, or like the one slide where we showed the rental population is predominantly single individual households. So we can share that, and then providers obviously make up decisions based on whether they want to be serving families, or if they are looking for greatest need, and all these kind of calculations. And because they're being supported generally through funding through an RFP process, there's an aspect of being able to help influence that. I do think that, just from a broader perspective, Jen, to your question about how do we maybe have that same influence on a market solution when you're talking about private builders, and if we were just trying to get supply built. I think some of it could be, when we look at built form, just to kind of pick on one thing, is secondary units a lot of times tend to be more bachelor style, or single bedroom units, as opposed to family units. That might be a bit of where that gets to, but I think it's encouraging probably more supply in general, and encouraging that, and how do you make that happen. I do think that there is probably a great conversation, and maybe somebody has the solution to how you influence it, but I do think that's definitely a challenge.
okay. Tiffany, the wordsmith here, wrote in the chat. She was talking about how thresholds have changed over time for affordability. And basically, that 30% figure was a lot less. And how do we actually start having conversations around what we can truly afford? I guess,
Hmm.
in summation.
I think that's an interesting
Right.
community conversation,
Mm-hmm.
because I understand the idea of how, when we change that threshold, people are basing on that, thinking, oh, I mean, we put the calculation up on the screen, and I'm willing to hazard a guess that maybe at least one person pulled out a calculator at some point to take a look at maybe where their affordability lies in that 30%.
Hopefully.
but but I think that's, it comes to conversations that are, a lot of think tanks put out research papers on kind of the basket of goods costs, and with regards to inflation. I think that's a broader conversation than housing. Obviously, we're focused on that 20 to 30% of housing, but I mean, I think we're talking about a systemic issue of debt burden that might branch out further than this conversation.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation for sure. Sarah Whalen, just moving on to another question, being mindful of time. She was asking if there's any data on how housing affordability is affected by immigration.
Yeah, that's a growth indicator that we didn't display for you today, but certainly, um, actually on one of the top three resources we have for you today. If you click on the City of Hamilton community profile through his department, James has outlined what's happening in terms of migration into Hamilton. So James, I don't know if you want to speak further.
What about
Yeah.
on a larger scale, like international migration, not just like Toronto to Hamilton migration? I think is
So
more the question.
yeah. So I think that's. I mean, there is. We don't have any, I guess, data specifically pointing to the impact on immigration. I think you could do a uh, a simple analysis that looks at, where's our housing supply grown and how much immigration have we had, but I don't think that tells the whole picture of it.
Mhm.
Because I will say, if you look at some of the growth in Hamilton, I think it isn't necessarily international immigration that has uh, grown our population as much as the the Toronto, the not picking on Toronto, but the interprovince or intra-province instead of the interprovince growth of it, and that has an impact. Um, some of the details on the immigration, I think, is also highlighting maybe some of the different family types as a percentage of what that is for providing housing as a note. But there is a full analysis on well, not a full, a two-pager analysis under the community profiles that might be interesting. And Sarah, if you want to talk about more about that, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I think Margaret's question plays into it a bit as well. She's asking, is there data available of foreign ownership of housing in Hamilton? Since that's a pretty hot topic, and Jasmine, you probably dealt with it out in Vancouver since they have the tax out there. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, okay. I wondered if this question was related to a vacancy tax in some way, but it's really about what's happening in our community. And so, Vancouver, Ottawa, from my experience, we're like, yeah, we're all different in Canada, even though we're, managed the same. So is there data on foreign ownership of housing in Hamilton? I don't know if stats can, from that level of government, tracks that information here in Hamilton, but not to say that, if there is a need to collect data with stats can you there's always a partnership opportunity there to define the data needs of the city. But I haven't come across that, but I'm not, I haven't been here for forever. I've been here for a minute. So I just wonder, uh, yeah.
So, so what I would just say is it has definitely been a topic of conversation. I haven't seen any specific data on foreign ownership affecting or impacting the housing market in Hamilton. Not to
Yeah.
say that it isn't, but simply that I haven't seen the data of how much that is. And I think I would just add that I think based on the kind of the Vancouver example, that it's not simply a foreign ownership issue, it's a foreign ownership of and units being kept vacant, right? So it's the
Yeah.
kind of phantom supply, if you will, where you talk about how many units are in the universe, but if those units are not being occupied and what that challenge is.
That's great. Thank you. So Sarah just left another note in there in the chat. And I think we have 2 minutes left, so maybe we'll just close. Cord?
For sure, yeah. So I'd like to thank the presenters, Jasmine and James, for a job well done, and also thank Jennifer Roth for helping out with the questions. And Clem is also behind the scenes, so thank you for your support as well, and to the entire Employee Engagement Committee. And of course, a big thank you to all of our guests here who have spent their lunch hour with us. That's much appreciated. It keeps these things, going. And just a note that a follow-up email will be sent. It will have links to the presentation as well as to the recording on our YouTube channel. And also watch your inbox for details of our upcoming Lunch and Learns. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon, everybody.